Hello, and welcome to the third episode of the Solidarity Podcast. Today we're diving into a crucial and complex topic, global apartheid. Ever since the start of the Israel genocide on Gaza, a clear escalation from their previous policy of apartheid, there has been a lot of talk of the state of apartheid in Palestine. However, there is a larger underlying apartheid that enables this, a global one. Think of global apartheid as a VIP section at a club. The rich get bottle service and luxury, while everyone else is stuck outside paying just to exist for the shitty service. So, let's explore global apartheid's characteristics, its origins, and most importantly, how it can be dismantled. To guide our discussion, we'll be drawing comparisons to historical apartheid systems, specifically in South Africa and occupied Palestine before the Palestinian genocide began on October 7, 2024. Let's begin by defining what we mean by global apartheid. The term apartheid is legally defined by the United Nations as a systematic oppression of one racial group over another to maintain dominance. But what happens when we extend this framework beyond national borders? Global apartheid refers to a world order where economic, political, and social mobility is structurally determined by race, nationality, and economic standing, creating deep inequalities between the global north, also known as core countries, and a global south, also referred to as periphery countries. This system operates through globalization, which rather than leveling the playing field, has entrenched disparities in wealth and opportunity. In the Global Minotaur, Yanis Varoufakis presents an analysis of the global economy, explaining its evolution from post-World War II to the 2008 financial crisis. He uses the metaphor of the Minotaur from Greek mythology to describe the dominant role of the United States in global finance after the collapse of the Bretton Woods system in 1971. The Bretton Woods system, established in 1944, was a global monetary framework designed to ensure financial stability and economic cooperation after the Second World War. It introduced fixed exchange rates where countries pegged their currencies to the US dollar, which was convertible to gold at $35 per ounce, making the dollar the global reserve currency. This relationship was not to last, as true to its nature, the US had strong commitment issues. The system also led to the creation of key financial institutions such as the International Monetary Fund, also known as the IMF, and the World Bank, which supposedly were meant to finance post-war reconstruction and later on develop projects as well as provide financial aid to countries facing economic instability. But in reality, they became an important arm of global apartheid. That's why it's often said, why do the IMF and World Bank make terrible therapists? Because they claim to help struggling economies, but their advice always comes with crippling conditions. To maintain stability, capital controls were allowed, preventing excessive currency speculation in the beginning, while promoting trade liberalization, although this liberalization only applied to some countries and not to all. However, by the late 1960s and early 1970s, the system began to unravel due to the US printing more dollars than it had gold reserves, particularly to finance the Vietnam War and the welfare programs. This was in essence the US stealing money from every country that had pegged its currency to the dollar. Everyone trusted the US because of its pinky promise, but turns out it had crossed its fingers behind its back in 1971. This led to the Nixon shock. In 1971, when President Richard Nixon, the infamously trustworthy American president, suspended the gold convertibility of the dollar, effectively collapsing the system. By 1973, major economies transitioned to a floating exchange rate system, making the shift towards modern finance globalization, currency speculation, and neoliberal economic policies. Instead of protesting this, however, the capitalists of major countries such as Germany or Japan took this opportunity to enrich themselves. As I discussed this in the last episode, this led to major investment in the real estate market, especially in the US, but also other global north countries, leading to the insane prices we're experiencing today. The foundation of the global apartheid argument is rooted in world systems theory developed by sociologist Emanuel Wallerstein. He categorizes nations into three tiers: core nations, which wield economic and political power, such as Western Europe, North America, Australia, and New Zealand; periphery nations, which provide labor and resources at exploitative rates, such as African, Latin American, and Asian countries; and semi-periphery nations, which exists between these two extremes, benefiting from some advantages while still experiencing exploitation. An example of this would be a country like Turkey. This division is not arbitrary. It is the direct result of centuries of colonialism, capitalism, and now neoliberal globalization. Like a rigged relay race, colonialism ran the first lap, capitalism sprinted ahead. Neoliberal globalization took the final stretch, and the global south is still stuck at the start line, having its pair of running shoes stolen before the day began. Antonio Negri and Michael Hardt argue in the book Empire that this system has actually evolved beyond nation states and is now controlled by a decentralized network of global institutions, multinational corporations, and transnational forces. They call this the empire. This is a common theory, not just within academia but also a liberation leader. Kwame Nkrumah, the first president of Ghana and a leading Pan-Africanist, developed a comprehensive theory of neocolonialism, which he articulated in his book Neocolonialism: The Last Stage of Imperialism in 1965. His theory argued that although many African and other formerly colonized countries had achieved political independence, they remained economically and politically dependent on their former colonial rulers and Western capitalist powers, like a bad breakup, because the former colonies were told they were independent, but their also known as Western powers, still controlled their finances, call the shots, and show up uninvited. In many cases, for decades after the so-called independence, the central banks of these countries were controlled by their former colonies, and many loans that were taken on behalf of these colonies by their former colonizers were still the responsibility of these independent nations to repay. When countries, an example would be when Burkina Faso, for example, in the 80s, tried to refuse to pay these loans as they were not the ones that had taken it, a coup was staged and Thomas Sankara, the leader, was assassinated. In other words, colonial nations took out loans on the behalf of their colonies. They used those loans to oppress the people in the colonies, and after they gave them quote-unquote independence, asked them to repay them their money or they will invade them again. Now, let's talk about the economic and social segregation of this system. For a system to qualify as apartheid, economic and social segregation must be deeply entrenched. Globalization ensures the free flow of capital and commodities, yet restricts the movement of people based on race, nationality, and economic class. This is evident in, for example, the migration policies. The militarized borders of the EU, the US-Mexico border, as well as Australia and New Zealand, disproportionately restrict movement from periphery countries while encouraging the movement of capital. In terms of labor exploitation, skilled workers from the periphery are allowed into core nations only when they are most economically profitable, placing the cost of their education and development on the home countries. There are major wage disparities. Industrialized nations maintain high wages while outsourcing low-wage labor to developing nations, reinforcing economic dependency. This also flies in the face of the pro-market, pro-capitalist argument that the market balances itself out, because the argument is that if you're underpaying people in an area, they will just move to another area where their labor is respected, and this is why they say the wages are fair under capitalism. However, if you have hard borders, militarized borders where people are not able to freely move around, then this whole argument falls apart. This is reminiscent of apartheid South Africa, where white citizens received social benefits while black South Africans were systematically excluded from welfare programs and forced into segregated, underfunded communities. The movement of those not white was restricted by the security forces. This is paralleled in the global case, as mentioned. Core nations build economic systems that exploit periphery nations while keeping their populations in conditions of forced underdevelopment. They also dehumanize them in their media to ensure their own population remain indifferent to their exploitation. Wars in the Middle East aren't real wars, as that's just what they do. The outrage only comes out when Europe's golden child and its latest settler colony Israel is attacked. Like a reality show, it carefully edits the footage to make sure you only feel bad for the right contestants, while ignoring the ones suffering behind the scenes. Liberals that call themselves leftists advocate for recycling and electric cars to save the planet, never uttering a single word about the children and workers in Congo paying the price. Latinos are called lazy, while they do all the work Americans wouldn't do and are invaded or couped when they try to organize and create jobs and better lives for themselves in their own countries. You lose if you leave, you lose if you stay. This dehumanization goes even further when people try to migrate. A migrant isn't a human being in this system. Those who are able to immigrate through what's called legal means are broken down to numbers and stats, what you can offer, and what they can get out of you. In most cases, this boils down to finances. If you can afford it, we'll accept you, and only then you'll be treated like a person. If not, good luck in the sea. You can tell it's all about finances because countries like Canada, with struggling healthcare services, for example, routinely accept doctors from overseas but implement so many obstacles that they never end up working as doctors in these countries. They basically find professions where people make a lot of money and they attract them, never intending them to work in their own profession, just wanting them to bring their money. So, as I said, if you stay, you're exploited. If you leave, you're demonized. And no matter what you do, the system is rigged against the global south. While racism and misogyny appear to be declining in core countries, or at least they did until recently, as I discussed in the first episode, their struggle remains intact on a global scale. Racism in the core has transformed into economic gatekeeping, as mentioned, only allowing migrants deemed economic profitable to enter. Meanwhile, gender equality has improved for certain privileged women, but conditions for women in the periphery and even core countries have worsened due to globalization. Bell Hooks critiqued white liberal feminism for prioritizing the experiences of white middle class women while neglecting the struggles of poor working class black, indigenous, and other marginalized women. In her book, Ain't I a Woman, 1981, and Feminism for Everybody, 2000, she exposed how mainstream feminism often treats gender oppression as a universal issue, overlooking the intersecting impact of race and class. She rejected neoliberal feminism, which she saw as individualistic and corporate friendly, advocating for personal success rather than challenging systematic oppression. Hooks also criticized white feminists for their failure to address colonialism and imperialism, arguing that many simply sought inclusion in power structures rather than working to dismantle global economic injustice. She notably critiqued Betty Friedan's The Feminist Mystique for centering suburban housewives as the most oppressed women, ignoring the realities of black and working class women who had always been part of the labor force, often under exploitative conditions. Tithi Bhattacharya expands on these critiques through social reproduction theory, highlighting how capitalism exploits women's labor both in the workplace and at home. Under capitalism, working class women experience a double burden, she says, juggling wage labor and unpaid reproductive labor like childcare and household duties. This inequality is worsened as reproductive labor is outsourced to racialized low-wage workers, often migrant women from the global south, reinforcing a global hierarchy of exploitation. Austerity measures and privatization exacerbate the problem by cutting public funding to services like healthcare and childcare, further increasing unpaid labor for low-income women. Bhattacharya links this trend to neoliberal globalization, arguing that capitalism shifts the cost of social reproduction onto the most vulnerable, sustaining economic inequality under the guise of personal responsibility. Both Hooks and Bhattacharya advocate for radical intersectional feminism that goes beyond elites' market-driven narratives, centering anti-capitalist and grassroots organizing to uplift all marginalized women, not just a privileged few. Silvia Federici highlights that the conditions faced by women in periphery nations today mirror those faced by women in Europe during the rise of capitalism. Unpaid labor, systematic violence, and economic exclusion, the worsening conditions of women globally are not accidental but an integral part of capitalist expansion. In the book Empire, Michael Hardt and Antonio Negri delve into the evolution of racism within the context of global capitalism. They argue that traditional biologically rooted racism has transformed into a more insidious form they term imperial racist theory. This modern racism, they argue, abandons overt biological essentialism, instead relying on cultural and social differences to perpetuate discrimination. In doing so, it also presents cultures as essentialist. Imperial racist theory co-opts anti-racist arguments by acknowledging that races are not biologically distinct, yet it continues to enforce racial hierarchies through cultural differentiation. This shift allows contemporary societies to appear anti-racist on the surface while maintaining systematic inequalities. Étienne Balibar describes, this racism without race replaces biological foundations with cultural ones, making discrimination more covert and pervasive. Hardt and Negri's analysis highlights how, in the era of empire, power structures have adapted, utilizing cultural signifiers to sustain radical racial divisions and control. This also allows the discrimination of some migrants and the acceptance of some other migrants into the core countries. It is still racism, just a different form of it. Now, let's talk about the myth of the Cold War. As we discussed, a major way for global apartheid to emphasize its legitimacy is the dehumanization of the global south. War crimes are only war crimes if committed in the global north. Wars are only actually wars if they take place in global north. Somehow, one of the deadliest periods in human history is called the Cold War. The only place the conflict was cold was Europe, North America, Australia, and New Zealand. Subcomandante Marquez, the spokesman for the Zapatista Army of National Liberation, a rebellious group in Mexico, outlined this in his theory of the Fourth World War. In his 1997 work, The Fourth World War Has Begun, he argues that after the Cold War, which he refers to as the Third World War, a new kind of global conflict emerged, one that is not fought with traditional armies, but through neoliberal economic policies, corporate domination, and systematic oppression of the poor. According to Marcos, neoliberalism itself is a form of warfare waged by powerful global actors who use financial institutions like the IMF and the World Bank to trap nations in debt and dependency, enforcing economic policies that serve corporate interests while impoverishing local populations. Marcus critiques nation-states, claiming they no longer serve their people, but act as enforcers of global capital and apartheid. Governments, instead of protecting citizens, implement policies that benefit corporations at the expense of workers, farmers, and indigenous people. To maintain global apartheid, ideological justifications are necessary, the same way ideological justifications were necessary for colonialism. This is where Edward Said's concept of Orientalism comes in. The West has long framed the East and the Global South through a lens of exoticism, primitivism, and underdevelopment. These narratives serve a purpose. They justify economic and military interventions while keeping periphery nations in a state of dependencies. Said's Orientalism will be the subject of the next episode and warrants much more explanation. However, as he explains, by painting those from the periphery countries in an essentialist manner, the belief that certain characteristics, quantities, or traits are inherent and unchanging in individuals or groups creates stereotypes and racist narratives much easier. Similarly, Latin America has been subjected to peripheral Orientalism, where North Americans' narratives depict the region as chaotic and in need of intervention. Erik Camayd-Freixas argues that Latin American intellectuals have grappled with these imposed identities, showing how colonial legacies continue to shape modern discourse, creating the circle discussed earlier. Latin Americans are inherently lazy, they say, authoritarian and violent. That is why, when they organize democratically and peacefully to improve their labor conditions, or use unused land for growing food to keep the fruits of their labor and natural resources, they are met with violence in the form of military interventions or coups. Such is the hypocrisy of the global apartheid order. And well, when they try to leave and move to the US, they are lazy criminals that somehow perform all the hard jobs Americans don't want to do and have the lowest crime rates in country. Also, a quick reminder that even in the US's fucked up legal system, entering the country illegally is not a criminal offense. So, as we've explored throughout this episode, global apartheid is not just a metaphor, it's a structured system of control, deeply embedded in economic, political, and ideological mechanisms that keep the global south in a state of permanent subjugation. From financial institutions like the IMF and World Bank to militarized borders, labor exploitation, and media narratives that dehumanize entire populations, the system ensures that wealth and power remain concentrated in the hands of the privileged few, while billions are left struggling for basic dignity. The reality is that this system isn't broken, it's working exactly as intended, whether through the legacy of colonialism, capitalism, and neoliberal globalization, or the manufacturing of consent through Orientalist and racist narratives. Global apartheid justifies itself while keeping people trapped in cycles of oppression. As Subcomandante Marcos described, Modern warfare isn't just fought with bombs, but with debt, trade policies, and economic strangulation. And yet, history has shown that no system of oppression lasts forever. From anti colonial struggles to worker movements, feminist resistance, and indigenous uprisings, people have always fought back. The challenge ahead is not just recognizing these structures, but actively dismantling them by challenging new liberal policies, resisting manufactured narratives, and organizing across borders in solidarity. It is also helpful to educate ourselves in these subjects. I will include a list of all the books I've used for this episode. I highly recommend checking them out. So, if you take one thing from this episode, let it be this: global apartheid is not an inevitability, it is a choice made by those in power, and if it's a choice, then it can be undone, but only if we refuse to accept it. Next week, as mentioned, I'm going to be talking about Orientalism by Edward Said. It's a fascinating subject that deserves its own episode. Until next time, enjoy and resist.